He knocked on my door just after midnight, and by dawn, my life was no longer mine. The wind that night screamed against the cliffs like something alive, clawing at the shutters of the Emberlight Inn as if demanding entry. Snow had buried the road hours ago, yet I kept the fire burning and the door unlatched, because hope was the only thing left to sell. The storm had emptied the tavern early. No carriages, no laughter, only the slow pulse of the coals and the ticking of the old clock above the bar, its pendulum keeping time with my exhaustion. I was cleaning the same table for the third time when I heard it. A single, deliberate knock that didn't belong to the storm. No one traveled this pass after sundown, not in winter, not since the wolves had returned and the miners had vanished one by one. For a moment, I told myself it was the wind, some trick of ice and echo, but then it came again. Slow, hollow, human. I crossed the room before I could think better of it. The hinges moaned as I opened the door, and the cold came in like a blade. He stood there, half buried in snow, a tall figure cloaked in black, his hair soaked, and his eyes, those eyes, reflecting the lantern light as if it hurt him. He didn't speak at first. His breath hung in the air, motionless, not mist, but smoke, thin and colorless. His clothes were too fine for any local, velvet under the frost, silver clasps shaped like thorns. He looked like someone who had never been cold before tonight. "Please," he said finally, his voice hoarse but clear, the accent of some forgotten kingdom. The road. It vanished behind me. I should have shut the door. The smart thing would have been to lock it and pretend I'd seen nothing, but his lips were blue, his hands shaking, and something about him, his quiet, the way he didn't plead, just stood there waiting for judgment, unraveled my caution. I stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze to death," I said, trying to sound firm, though my heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. He obeyed, moving with the slow precision of someone afraid the ground might give way. When the light touched him, the fire guttered low, as if the flames were afraid. He stripped off his gloves, and I saw a ring on his finger. Silver. Heavy. The stone black and veined with red like a drop of heart's blood trapped in glass. "Sit by the hearth," I said. "I'll bring stew." He hesitated. "You shouldn't trouble yourself." "Trouble keeps me warm," I said, and disappeared into the kitchen before the sight of his eyes, dark, rimmed in scarlet, could make me regret my impulse. When I returned, he was standing before the fire, not sitting. His reflection wavered in the iron grate, broken and incomplete. I set the bowl on the table, the smell of herbs and meat filling the room. "Eat," I said. "You look half dead." "I'm worse," he murmured. And when he smiled, it wasn't mockery. It was the smile of someone who remembered what warmth used to feel like. He took the spoon, lifted it halfway, and then set it down again. "It smells wonderful. But I cannot." "You can't or you won't." He looked up sharply. "You don't want the truth to that question." I folded my arms. "Try me." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the fire as if it were inside him, not outside. "If I told you, you'd never offer a stranger food again." "I don't get many strangers," I said, "and I hate waste." For the first time he laughed, a low, unsteady sound that made the hair at my nape rise. He lifted the cup of mulled wine I'd poured and held it in his hand. Steam rose though the liquid had gone cold. "You see," he said softly, "even warmth runs from me." I tried to ignore the way my skin prickled, the whisper of every village tale I'd ever heard, the ones about pale wanderers, about men with red eyes and no shadows. But his face wasn't the face of a monster. It was the face of a man worn thin by grief. "Stay the night," I said. "You can leave at first light. The storm will kill you otherwise." He turned his gaze to me, and the air seemed to tighten between us, as if the world had just decided to hold its breath. "You should not invite what you don't understand," he said gently. "Then help me understand." For a moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, "No one has ever asked me that." He sank into the chair at last, the fire painting his skin gold. His hands trembled, as if unused to being still. The hours slipped by with the storm. He spoke little, only to ask questions that made me uneasy. How long I had lived alone, whether anyone would come if I screamed. His tone wasn't threatening, only curious, as if he'd forgotten how ordinary people existed. When I asked his name, he gave a faint, distant smile. "Kyle," he said at last. "Once." "Once?" "Names lose their meaning when kingdoms fall," he replied, staring into the flames. "Mine fell a very long time ago." I almost asked which kingdom he meant, but something in his voice stopped me. He sounded less like a traveler and more like a survivor of something ancient. When I finally climbed the stairs to prepare a room for him, I left the candle burning low. Behind me, I thought I heard him whisper something. Not words, but a melody. Soft and mournful, older than prayer. I didn't sleep. The wind howled against the glass, and every creak of the floorboards felt like footsteps. Just before dawn, I rose to check the fire. But when I reached the common room, the chair by the hearth was empty. His cloak was gone. Only the ring lay on the table, silver catching the gray light. I picked it up to move it, but the metal pulsed warm beneath my skin, as if it recognized me. Outside, the snow had stopped. The first light of morning broke over the mountains, sharp and cold, and I realized my breath wasn't the only one hanging in the air. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the window pane, watching. And when I blinked, it was gone. By the time the second evening came, the silence around the Emberlight Inn had grown too complete, too heavy, as if the storm itself had been holding its breath since the stranger's departure. The snow no longer fell, but it lay thick as ash over the road, muffling every sound, until even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the stillness. Alara had spent the day pretending life had gone back to normal, mending a torn curtain, scrubbing the floor, feeding the fire until the air was thick with smoke. Yet nothing felt right. The place no longer belonged entirely to her. It felt watched, altered, marked by the memory of the man she had taken in from the snow. She found herself glancing at the ring she had left on the counter, its black stone dull in the afternoon light. She had tried once to move it to the cupboard, thinking it safer there, but her fingers had refused to release it until she whispered the name he had given her. Kyle. And then the metal had gone cold again. Harmless. She told herself she imagined that part. Grief and isolation could do strange things to the mind. When dusk fell, a distant sound broke the hush, a steady rhythm that did not belong to wind or trees, hooves crunching snow, the low metallic jangle of armor. Alara froze where she stood, heart hammering, and moved to the window. Down the road from the pass came a line of riders, their torches stabbing through the dusk, their horses cloaked in smoke-colored blankets. At first she thought they might be soldiers from the capital, perhaps lost in the mountains like the stranger, until she saw the banners. Black cloth embroidered with a red sun eclipsed by a crown. She had never seen the symbol before, but every instinct in her screamed danger. The riders stopped before the inn. Their leader dismounted, tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes a colorless gray that caught no light. "Open in the name of the crown," he called. His voice carried no echo, only command. Alara's pulse tripped. The last time soldiers had come this far north had been years ago, when taxes were still collected from dying villages. She forced herself to open the door, swallowing the tremor in her voice. "There's no trouble here, sir," she said. "Only a tired innkeeper and an empty hearth." The soldier studied her face, as though measuring the truth in every breath she took. "You had a guest last night," he said flatly. "A man, tall, dark-haired, traveling alone." His gaze shifted past her shoulder into the dim room. "Where is he?" Ilara's blood ran cold. "He left at dawn," she said, too quickly. "Didn't even pay. If you find him, tell him he owes me for stew and a ruined chair." The soldier didn't smile. "You speak lies poorly, human. The man you harbored is guilty of regicide and treason against the vampire court. His name is Kyle Draven, heir to the Crimson Line. He murdered his father, the king, and fled into the human lands. Have you seen him?" Vampire court? The word struck her like an open palm. She wanted to laugh, to deny the absurdity. But the way he said it, the calm assurance, the complete absence of doubt, made laughter impossible. She remembered the way the stranger had avoided the fire, how his reflection had wavered, how the wine had steamed in his hand. Her mind rebelled, but her heart already knew. She forced herself to meet the soldier's gaze. "I told you," she said quietly. "He's gone." The man stepped forward, close enough that she could see the thin veins of black that traced the whites of his eyes. Not human veins. "If you lie to me," he said, "you will not live to regret it." He raised a hand and gestured toward the doorframe. Another soldier approached, a woman this time, her armor glinting like oil. "Search the place." "No one is here but me," Ilara protested, but the woman brushed past her, moving with unnatural speed, vanishing into the stairwell. The leader watched Ilara, expressionless, as though waiting for her to betray herself with movement. From upstairs came the sound of furniture being overturned, drawers opened, wood splintering under force. Ilara clenched her fists, helpless rage and terror tangling in her chest. The woman returned a moment later, shaking her head. "No one," she said. "But—" She opened her hand to reveal a small object gleaming on her palm. Ilara's stomach dropped. The ring. The soldier held it between two fingers, turning it so that the torchlight caught the black stone. "The royal crest," she said. "Crown and thorn. It's his." The leader's gaze hardened. So he was here. Ilara's voice came out as a whisper. "He left it behind. I didn't know what it was." "Did he drink from you?" the man asked suddenly. "Did he mark you?" "What?" He seized her wrist with cold, inhuman strength, pulling up her sleeve to examine her skin. "No punctures," he muttered, releasing her with a shove. "Then you are fortunate. Still, aiding a fugitive prince carries death even for mortals. The new king has decreed it." "New king?" she repeated, dizzy. The soldier smiled without warmth. "Varric Draven, the regent. He ascended the night of the old king's murder. His first act was to purge the traitor's name," he gestured to his company. "Burn it. Let the ashes remind her of mercy." Ilara barely had time to scream before one of the riders raised his torch and hurled it through the open doorway. Fire spread like spilled oil across the floorboards, hungry and fast. She ran for the bucket by the well, but a gloved hand caught her hair, dragging her back. The leader leaned close, his breath a mix of iron and frost. "If he returns," he hissed, "tell him his bloodline ends tonight." Then he released her and vanished into the snow with the others, their torches bobbing like dying stars, as they disappeared down the road. By the time she smothered the flames, half the tavern was blackened, the air thick with smoke. She stood in the ruins, shaking, the stench of burned oak filling her lungs. She wanted to weep, but couldn't. There was nothing left but anger, bitter and raw. She had tried to help a stranger, and this was her reward. She was gathering what unbroken dishes remained when the door opened again. For one breath, she thought the soldiers had returned. Then she saw him. Kyle stood in the doorway, snow melting into vapor around his boots. His cloak was gone, his shirt torn and stained dark, where blood should have been, but wasn't. The firelight caught his face, pale as moonstone, and for the first time, she saw the truth without illusion. His eyes glowed with a muted crimson light, his pupils narrow as a cat's. His movements were too smooth, too silent. A predator's grace. "I warned you not to invite what you don't understand," he said softly. Ilara's knees almost gave way. "They came looking for you," she managed. "Soldiers. They said you killed your father." His expression barely changed, but something like pain flickered beneath the calm. "Then the coup is complete." "They burned my inn," she said, her voice breaking. "They nearly killed me." Kyle looked around the charred room, his jaw tightening. "Varric," he murmured, the name a curse. "He has moved faster than I thought." He turned to her. "Did they hurt you?" "No, but they found the ring." That made him go still. "Did they take it?" She shook her head. "No. The woman gave it to her commander. But when they left, it fell. She held out her hand. The ring gleamed there once more, as if it had never been taken. It came back. Kyle stared at it, his eyes darkening until the red nearly disappeared. "It chose you." "Chose me?" "It's bound to the bloodline. It carries the seal of kingship, the last will of my father. Whoever holds it is marked by the oath." He met her gaze. "And now they will kill you for it." The words struck like ice. "Then take it," she said, thrusting her hand toward him. "It's yours." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because once the ring claims a bearer, it cannot be reclaimed by force. Only freely given. And it no longer answers to me." For a moment, they stood facing each other in the smoke-filled silence, the air trembling between them with the weight of what couldn't be undone. Ilara saw something raw in his eyes then. Not hunger, not arrogance, but a grief so old it had no language left. "I never wanted this," he said at last. "Any of it. But fate delights in cruelty." "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked toward the window where the night pressed against the glass. "What I must. Survive long enough to reclaim what was stolen, and keep you alive in the process. I don't need your protection." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "No, but you have it anyway." Outside, thunder rolled without lightning, a sound deeper than any storm. Kyle's gaze flicked upward, listening. "They're already hunting again," he said. "The Regent won't rest until the seal is destroyed." He moved closer, his presence filling the room like a shadow come alive. "You can stay here and die when they return, or come with me and risk a worse fate. Choose quickly." Ilara stared at the charred walls, the smoke still curling like ghosts of her old life, and knew there was no choice at all. "Where?" she asked. "South," he said, "to the ruins of St. Aerith's monastery. The wards there still recognize royal blood. It's the only place left they cannot enter." She hesitated only a heartbeat longer before nodding. Keel extended his hand, the faintest tremor of restraint in his fingers. And when she took it, The ring flared between them, a pulse of crimson light that bound their shadows together on the floor. For an instant, she thought she heard a whisper. Not his voice, not her own, but something older, distant, speaking in a tongue of vows and blood. When the light faded, Cale's grip tightened just enough to steady her. "From this moment," he said, "your life and mine are one thread. If you die, so do I." And with that, the exiled prince and the innkeeper stepped into the snow, leaving behind the smoking ruin of her world and the faint echo of a promise neither yet understood. The road to St. Erith's was less a road than a memory of one, a pale scar winding through black pines and drifts that swallowed footprints as soon as they were made. And as Alara followed in Cale's wake, the quiet of the forest pressed close, until even her breath sounded like trespass. Yet the farther they went, the more she felt the ring warming against her skin, a small, insistent pulse that seemed to tug them onward, as if the world itself were a loom and some invisible hand had decided their thread would not be cut tonight. Cale moved like a shadow that had learned to wear a body, tireless and precise. But there was a stiffness to him that hadn't been there the first night, a restraint in his shoulders and throat. And when she finally asked if he was hurt, he only shook his head once without looking back, which would have been answer enough even if she hadn't seen the way his jaw tightened every time the wind shifted, as though he smelled something on it that did not belong to snow or pine or human fear. They made the pass at last and began to descend into a bowl of hills where the moon showed itself in ragged halves between racing clouds. And with every step, the cold seemed to deepen from weather into presence, the kind that gathers in old places and remembers names until Alara could taste metal on her tongue and knew they were near something consecrated or ruined or both. When the walls of the monastery emerged from the trees, they were not the noble reliquary she had imagined from childhood stories, but a broken ring of stone mounded with snow. The bell tower sheared away long ago, and the chapel roof caved to show a pattern of ribs against the sky. Yet in the gaps between ruin and night, there were threads of red light spread thin as cobweb, barely visible until the moon struck them, and they answered. And Kyle slowed for the first time, head tilted like a hound. Catching music, not scent, he stopped at the outer arch, lifting a hand toward the invisible barrier, and the air trembled with a sound she felt in her teeth more than heard, a chord made of warning and old oaths, and when his fingers touched nothing at all, the red threads flared into a lattice that caught his palm like glass. He did not flinch, which frightened her more than pain might have, and after a breath he turned to her, the color in his eyes darkening toward that mineral crimson that seemed less like blood than a memory of it fossilized. "It remembers the line," he said, his voice low and roughened by exhaustion or something worse, "but not me. The seal has shifted its loyalty, and the ward will not open unless you ask it." She stared past him at the fractured chapel and the web of red that now vibrated faintly, as if the place had woken and was listening to the ring's new pulse. And in that moment, the shape of the bond between them revealed itself with a clarity that left her breathless. Not romance or rescue or the hunger she feared in him, but a binding of purpose, as impersonal and intimate as gravity. A recognition written to stone long before she was born. She lifted her hand because there was nothing else to do, and spoke the simplest word she knew: "Please." And at the sound, the red threads shivered into a door of light that folded outward and vanished like fog, leaving the archway open to a courtyard of snow and broken statues, and Cale exhaled as if a knife had been pulled from his ribs. They crossed into the courtyard, and the cold changed again, shedding its feral edge for the brittle chill of rooms that have not known fire in 100 winters. And Alara found herself wondering what prayers sounded like when no one living remained who believed in them. Chaol led her to the side aisle, where the roof still held, and where an apse painted with saints and beasts and moons watched with sightless patience. And there, beneath a weathered fresco of a woman nursing a wolf, he sank to one knee so quickly she thought he had tripped. But when she took a step toward him, he raised a hand, not to ward her off but to steady himself. And she realized with a flash of nausea that it wasn't pain that made him clumsy. It was hunger, a terrible, clean hunger that had nothing to do with stew or bread or anything she could cook, and everything to do with what moved beneath her skin. He spoke carefully, each word set down as if it might break, telling her that he had fed last at dusk, 3 days before the soldiers came, and that afterward he had refused all blood out of a resolve that had seemed noble when he was alone, but had become folly the moment the ring chose a mortal bearer and made her a target. And while he explained, he kept his gaze fixed just left of her throat, like a penitent avoiding the tabernacle. And she thought how absurdly gentle his voice could sound when saying the most monstrous things, and how many lies she had heard in her life that felt uglier because they had no such honesty. She told him to do it quickly then, the words scraping her mouth raw, and when he shook his head she almost screamed at him, not in fear of his fangs, but in fury at the stubbornness that would make her choice meaningless. And he stopped her with a look not of command, but of apology, and said there was a way to take what he needed without marring her skin, an old court practice that left no marks but demanded trust, and he asked for that with no more ceremony than a hand lifted halfway to meet hers in the air between them. He had her show the ring to the apse and speak the plea again, and when the ward sighed, its answer, a new sound, rose beneath it, a resonance like a second voice echoing the first, and Chaol told her that St. Erith's had been built over a wellspring, where the living and the not quite dead met in neutrality, and that the water there could hold a vow and make it flesh, and that if she would grant him her hand for the span of a single breath, the spring would witness and moderate the hunger, turning what might have been violation into sacrament. The words were ridiculous and terrifying and beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful when you understand it will cut you cleanly. And she nodded, because there was no world in which she abandoned him to starve, and herself to soldiers, for the sake of a purity she no longer believed in. He led her down a stair chiseled from rock to a circular chamber, where the well lay like an eye in the earth, its surface black and still, and the ring grew hot enough that she almost dropped it. Yet the heat was not pain, but a steadying, as if some intelligence older than either of them approved the arithmetic of their despair. Chaol took her left hand in both of his and turned it palm up, not touching skin, only hovering, and asked her for her true name, the one her grandmother used when the world was kind. And when she spoke it, he repeated it so softly, it barely qualified as sound, and she felt the syllables settle on her bones as if they had always belonged there. He lowered her hand to the water until the surface kissed her wrist, and then his mouth hovered over the pulse point without pressure, and he breathed in sharply as if drowning and breaking the surface in the same instant. And when his lips finally touched her, it was not a bite, but a prayer, and the water stirred without rippling, and her heart slammed once, and then became a metronome, attended by another heartbeat, layered beneath, the echo of his chest answering hers until she could no longer tell which belonged to which. It lasted no longer than the time it takes a snowflake to melt on the tongue, and when he lifted his head, there were no wounds and no blood, only the deep discipline of a hunger satisfied with a sip where a draft had been offered, and the gratitude of a creature who had learned how to starve without forgetting how to thank. Relief left her dizzy, and she sank to the edge of the well and laughed once, voiceless, at the violence of her own fear, and at the absurdity that this, of all things, felt gentle. The chamber seemed to breathe then, the air warming by a degree no weather could explain, and Kyle said the bond was real now in both directions, that the spring had taken the shape of their vow and would lash pain to pain and survival to survival, until either the ring released her or death did, and he asked whether she understood what he had done to her, not as accusation, but as penance, and she nodded, because understanding was not the same as regret. When they climbed back to the nave, the night had thickened into that hour when the world loses track of itself, and even predators prefer to wait, and they set about making a shelter of benches and cloaks, and a windowless corner where the wind could not reach, and Alara realized how many times in her life she had done this for men who gave back nothing, only took warmth and coin and a place to leave their noise, and how strange it was to be preparing a bed for someone who frightened her, and yet took up less space with his body than the memory of their conversation. Kyle stood at the mouth of the aisle to watch the courtyard while she worked, his stillness now the calm of a fed storm rather than the brittleness of ice about to crack. And when she finished, she called him not by his borrowed name, but by the one he had spoken over the water, the one that had once carried a crown, and he answered as though a door had opened inside him, and the room had let in air for the first time in years. They slept in shifts, or tried to, and it was during the second false dawn, that hour when snow reflects enough sky to trick the body into believing in morning, that the hunters came, not in a clatter of hooves or armor, but as a shadow that did not belong to any object in the courtyard, sliding along the stones toward the arch, and Alara woke with the certainty that the ring had tugged her from sleep, the way a mother pulls a child from the path of a cart, and she reached for Kyle at the same moment he unfurled from the wall like smoke-made flesh. The ward sang once, high and clear, and something hit it with a force that shook frost from the eaves, and the red lattice leapt to full brightness, showing them the outlines of 3 figures pressed against the invisible glass, faces pale and furious, eyes reflecting the crimson net like embers floating in oil, and the tallest of them smiled without lips and raised a hand in salute that made Alara's stomach turn cold, for she recognized the colorless gray of his gaze even through the ward. The leader from the inn had found them. His mouth formed words that carried no sound through the barrier, but Kyle said them aloud, as if reading. Varric sends his regards, little prince, and his regret that the kennel must be cleaned before the dog is reclaimed. And Alara understood that mercy would not find them here. The hunters' silhouettes dissolved into mist and reformed on the far side of the wall like water trying to learn stone. And Kale said the wards would hold so long as the bearer of the seal remained willing to be protected, which was a polite way of saying that if she panicked or ran, the lattice would interpret it as revocation and welcome the knives in. And she swallowed her terror like a burning coal and stepped forward until her breath fogged the red light, then spread her fingers against it, and spoke aloud the names of every winter she had survived in this valley, turning memory into oath, and the web brightened until the hunters staggered back with their teeth bared and their mouths still making silent promises of what would happen. When dawn faded, and her courage with it, she did not look away, and after a long minute that felt like a year, the figures melted into the snow as if they had never been there. The courtyard empty again, except for the old statues and the trembling in her hands, which she hid by turning to, adjust a cloak that did not need adjusting. Chaol watched her with a quiet that had nothing of predation in it now, only assessment and an unfamiliar respect that embarrassed her more than gratitude would have. And he said that the ward had answered her more strongly than it ever answered a royal in his prime, that the bond between bearer and sanctuary was amplifying something in her that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the way she refused to surrender what little remained to her when the world decided to take the rest. The forced part of their alliance had been undeniable from the first flare of the ring. Yet standing there with the echo of the ward's song still in her mouth, she felt the axis shift from compulsion toward choice, no less dangerous for being shared. And when Chaol asked if she wanted him to leave at dusk, to draw the hunt away, she answered without thinking that he would not survive a night without the ward, and that she would not survive the morning without someone who could hear the silence, gather and tell her which way to point her fear, and the truth of it surprised them both into stillness. The rest of that day they spent like fugitives learning to be a household, mapping the monastery for escape routes, and kindling, salvaging a tarnished thurible to burn pine resin for smoke that would mask their scent, teaching the ring to open the side gate without lighting the entire sky. And somewhere between these necessary acts, Chaol asked questions that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the geometry of a life he had not lived for a long time, how her husband had laughed, how the miners' children learned to skate on the thawed pond in spring, what recipes human mothers passed down when flour ran out and pride remained. And he listened with a hunger that had no teeth, the kind that devours regret and spits out plans. By the time the second night took shape around the broken bell tower, the bond that had begun as accident and weapon had settled into something steadier, a line drawn in the snow that said "we," and when the wind shifted again and carried the taste of iron from the east, Chaol stood and said the court would not risk another frontal attempt, not tonight, that their enemy would prefer to pry as a thief preys at locks. And he looked at Alara's hand, where the ring lay quiet as a sleeping coal, and he told her without ornament that in the calculus of the coming days he was not the indispensable one here. She was because the seal that had chosen her could call doors to open and armies to hesitate, and laws to remember their own origins, and because he, for all his power, could not step through a single threshold without her word. At that, the moral line between their natures ceased to be an edge used to cut, and became instead the seam that joined, each to each, the way a wound closes from both sides if tended. And though neither of them spoke the sentiment aloud, the ring felt it and warmed enough to make both of them glance down, startled and a little amused, like parents caught by a child who has learned to answer before being called. Snow turned to hard glitter in the courtyard as another day bled into blue dusk, and with that slow change came the realization that the world beyond St. Erith's would not pause while they learned how to breathe in the same room. Word would travel along the frozen veins of the passes, whispers would enter kitchens and barracks, and the regent would stack decrees like stones until a wall of law closed around them as implacably as winter. Yet inside the monastery, the air retained the faint warmth of the well, and the ring's pulse settled into a rhythm that matched Alara's heartbeat so precisely she could tell, without looking, when Chaol approached the apse or stood at the arch. And this inexplicable comfort made the next intrusion feel like a hand closing on the back of her neck. It arrived just after the light thinned, not by hoof or boot, but by sound, a low chime that came from no visible bell, followed by a pressure behind the eyes that made both of them turn toward the nave at once. And in the air, over the cracked altar, a smear of darkness gathered and took the shape of parchment before unfurling with a brittle snap. The seal that held it, a knot of black wax, stamped with a thorned crown. Cale went still as a stag before an arrow, and Alara felt his caution draw tight as he gestured for her to remain where she was, though he must have known she would not. The parchment drifted down like ash, and when it touched the altar, the ward shuddered, as if deciding whether to admit it, then allowed the thing to rest there with the grudging neutrality of a temple repurposed by conquerors. He did not touch the missive immediately, but stared at the seal, as if memory could ignite and burn it to harmless soot. And only when Alara stepped beside him and slid the ring closer to the wax did the seal crack of its own accord, split by the old authority that now recognized her, not him. And the message opened to reveal a hand he knew. The regent's words were generous in the way of executioners announcing a holiday, cloaked in the language of duty and stability, offering amnesty to the confused tavern keeper who had been misled by a notorious parricide, offering protection to the villages and favorable tariffs to the mountain road if the sanctuary's ward were opened for a single hour at moonrise to admit investigators of the crown, insisting that the court merely wished to confirm the artifact's integrity and return the exiled prince to merciful custody. And beneath this velvet lay the barb Alara tasted before she reached the end. An accounting of names from Draymont, written with the cold precision of tax ledgers, including her own, and her dead husband's, and the old miner who brought her kindling on lean weeks, and the schoolmistress who taught letters to any child who could sit still for a half hour. And beside each name, a small mark in the margin, a thorn for those who had shown her kindness these last 2 years, and a star for those whose debts might be forgiven if she complied. She felt the calculus strike her like a thrown stone, the pared-down cruelty of a man who understood that threats scatter and promises bind. And when she lifted her eyes to Kyle, he was already shaking his head, not at her, but at the story repeating itself in a new century, a court using village lives as currency while calling the exchange patriotism, and something harsh and tender braided itself in her chest, because for the first time she saw not the prince who had terrified her on her threshold, but the son who had watched policy eat his people and had decided, too late perhaps, to spit it out. He took the parchment and fed it to the altar flame, and as the regent's neat letters twisted and blackened, he told her plainly that accepting the bargain would not, in fact, save anyone, that Varric had learned patience over a lifetime of being. Second, that he would smile and grant relief, and then strip Draymont in spring when the passes opened, and blame bandits, or flood, or the stubbornness of human crops. That the only thing the thorned crown feared was a story that could not be rewritten. A testament embedded in law and symbol strong enough to make even predators step around it, and that the will sealed in the ring, his father's true decree, the one no scribe loyal to Varric had touched, was precisely that kind of story, if they could find a way to open it where witnesses could not be silenced. He had thought, in the arrogance of surviving too long, that he could do this alone by force, that steel and shadow would suffice, and the look he gave her then was not supplication, not abdication either, but acknowledgement that the world had shifted and would not shift back, that she was no longer an accident in his war, but the hinge on which the door would swing. The well answered that unspoken oath with a whisper of warm air up the stair, and Alara put her palm to the stone of the altar and felt a throb like a heart beating beneath it, a residual consecration not fully erased by time or conquest. And for a breath she saw the chapel as it must have been, priests in winter wool lighting pale candles, mothers with infants pressed to their cloaks, soldiers laying down swords at the threshold because someone had convinced them that here a different law held sway, and the memory steadied her anger into something she could carry without spilling. "If we refuse," she said, "they will come at moonrise anyway, and they will come harder." And Kyle nodded, explaining that the red lattice could be forced from within if the bearer commanded it, that the sanctuary would interpret hospitality as law, and that if she named a single soul as guest, the ward would open to that name and that name alone, and would hold. Even if a legion pressed against it, a rule older than the coast treaties and older than the vampire courts, the kind of rule that crawls into human stories and becomes a taboo. Children can recite before they can write. It was the rule of sanctuary, he said, the one they had both felt without knowing when they crossed the arch, and if they used it wisely, it could turn the monastery from hiding place to courtroom, because words spoken under such a roof and witnessed by a mortal bearing the seal would bind even a regent hungry for crowns, at least long enough for the truth to be shouted down the passes faster than soldiers could ride. The plan sounded ridiculous and impossible, and then it sounded inevitable, because the alternatives were narrower and darker, and always ended with an unmarked grave in a snowdrift, and she told him so. And together they began to carve the night into shapes they might live through. He would summon those few still loyal to the old king, not with letters, too easily intercepted, but with a call only their kind could hear, a low note carried on the throat that made the gums ache and the jaw want to unhinge. And while he sang that private summons until frost shook loose from the rafters, Elara climbed to the bell tower stump and lit a lantern she had not dared light for days, shielding it with her cloak until it cast a steady halo that any human on the ridge could see. Stubborn sign that said the monastery was occupied, and defiant, and perhaps foolish enough to believe in rights older than any king. The first to answer was not a lord, but a woman in patched wool who came at a run from the south trail, her cheeks raw from cold and her eyes haunted. And when Elara met her at the arch and asked her name, the answer made Kyle stiffen like a bow drawn to the ear, for she said she had once been Sister Marin of St. Erith's before the court closed the abbey and turned its fields to pasture, and she had hidden the consecration bowl instead of surrendering it. And if there was still a well under the nave, then perhaps the old law would remember her hands. She carried no weapon, only a leather bundle and a reed of ink, and when she knelt inside the gate, the red lattice pulsed in welcome without being commanded, which should have been impossible and yet wasn't. And Elara understood that the safe haven had not only rules, it had preferences, and it preferred those who had bled for it. Before the hour had fully darkened, 2 more came climbing out of the pines, a boy barely 17 with frostbit ears, who stammered that his father had died on a tax road and that he could run messages without being seen, and an old steward with a limp whose right hand shook in the cold, but whose left carried a ledger bound in cracked red leather, a relic from the palace that he said would be useful because it contained the signatures of every noble who had sworn the oath at the old king's. Coronation and oaths, when read under a roof like this, would wake like dogs at their names. Kyle looked at these arrivals as a man looks at a spring after thinking the valley dried long ago. And in his gaze, Elara saw the hinge turn again, and she knew they had crossed the midpoint without fanfare, that the decision to protect each other had become the decision to protect the fragile idea that monsters and mortals could still be bound by law rather than appetite. It was not merely a strategy now, but a vow, and vows drew enemies the way fire draws night, which became plain when the last of the daylight slipped, and with it came a second missive, not writ on parchment, but spoken directly into the ward by a voice that made the hair on Ilara's arms lift, for it was intimate and cruel and familiar. The leader from the inn addressing her by name, as if they had shared bread, telling her that her grandmother's grave had been opened in the Dremont churchyard. Not defiled, he said quickly, only examined, because he was curious what kind of roots grew a woman brave enough to lie to his face, and that the bones were very clean, as if winter had taken even the scent of her from the soil. And when Ilara staggered, with the image the voice laughed, and in that laugh was the hint of a history, with Chaol no rumor had yet taught her, a rivalry too personal for public proclamations, the kind that begins in training yards and ends in throne rooms. Chaol stepped into the lattice until the red light wrote bars across his face, and told the unseen messenger that certain lines, once crossed, could not be walked back, and the reply came like frost on a wound, that lines were for those who needed rules, and that by moonrise the regent would have a name to speak that even sanctuary would have to answer. For there was, somewhere in the court's archives, an amendment written in a century of famine, granting royal auditors the right to enter wholly, ground to weigh grain and gold if a mortal guardian consented, and that amendment had a signature in red from a king now dead, and a countersign from a prior of St. Erith's who had sold the abbey's wheat to pay down a debt. And if they could find a living mortal to inherit that consent, perhaps the same Sister Merrin who now stood at Ilara's side, then the ward would open like a mouth that could not refuse its own tongue. The threat tasted too specific to be bluff, and Ilara saw the flinch Merrin could not quite hide, the way her hand went to the leather bundle as if to anchor herself to the present, and that was the hint of betrayal the knight had been waiting to. Present, not treachery in the woman, but in the history attached to her, a stain that might be used to force the gate, and for a long moment all of them stood in that suspended dread until the old steward cleared his throat and said, very calmly, that law cuts both ways when it is this old, that consent written by a prior in famine could be unstitched if the same line were reiterated by a living guardian under a restored oath witnessed by the spring, and that the countersign could be overruled by a bearer who spoke not from fear, but from choice. So they went down into the well chamber again, not as fugitive and keeper, but as sovereign and witness. And Merrin set the consecration bowl upon the stone, and cut her palm with a clean blade, and let 3 drops fall into the water, and Ilara placed the ring above the ripples until the black stone threw a scarlet vein into the spring, and Chaol unrolled the ledger and read the old king's name aloud, with the voice of a son speaking from the edge of grief's cliff. And when the echoes died, the chamber did not warm this time. It steadied into a temperature that felt like truth, and the steward wrote a counter-amendment in a careful hand, and Merrin signed, and Ilara signed, and Chaol signed, not as prince, but as witness to the bearer's will, and something in the rock eased that none of them had known was tense. When they climbed back into the nave, the moon had finally cleared the tower stump and laid a silver path across the nave, and along that path the ward shimmered, not red now, but pale as breath on glass, and a presence pressed against it that made the frescoes seem to watch with animal attention. Yet when the voice returned to demand entry in the name of famine law, the lattice answered with a clarity that made Ilara's teeth ring, declaring, not in words, but in the finality of a door that has decided to be shut, that the only entry permitted tonight would be by the names the bearer spoke aloud, and Alara, whose life had been a series of rooms where others dictated thresholds, took a breath and said, Kyle Draven. And then, after a heartbeat that tasted like defiance and home, and any soul who comes in peace to testify to the truth of the old king's will. And the red returned to the web like a blush under skin, and the world beyond the arch went very quiet, which is the kind of quiet that comes before something chooses a different weapon. Moonrise did not arrive like a single hour, but like a tide that forgot the shore, seeping silver into the nave until the cracked mosaics shone as if wet, and the cold tasted of iron and lavender, the scents of old ceremony, and for a little while, the fragile machine they had built out of faith and loopholes held together with the stubborn dignity of things repaired by loving hands. The boy runner shuttled between the arch and the side gate with whispers from the ridge, counting flares in the trees where humans watched with the wary reverence reserved for births and executions. Sister Marin traced a slow circle of ash and salt along the inner threshold, while murmuring fragments of songs the court had outlawed as superstition. The steward sat with his ledger and turned pages, as if he could steady the world by keeping his place between oaths. And Kyle moved along the shadowed edge of the nave like a dark pane being slid over a window, checking sight lines and listening for that subtle thinning of air that precedes an intrusion of will. Yet beneath this choreography, Alara sensed the ring becoming restless, in a way that was not panic, but premonition. The stone warming and cooling in pulses that didn't match her heart anymore, reminding her that the seal belonged to a lineage accustomed to surviving by reading the room a breath before knives knew they were knives. She kept her hand pressed to the pillar near the arch and named her fear into it, so it could not jump back into her mouth when she needed it quiet. She thought of the tavern she had lost, and the kindling the old miner had carried in for her, and the schoolmistress's thin hands, and with each image she found the anger that was cleaner than grief, the one that did not want revenge, only an end to the arithmetic that measured human lives in coins no one could spend. And this steadied her until the first betrayal presented itself not with a cry or a crash, but with a gentle tap, the sort of sound a polite guest makes when they do not wish to startle the host. At the southern sacristy door, there stood a girl no older than 12, hair braided with red thread the way mountain families do when winter takes a father, and the village mothers gather to teach the children that grief can be woven into something that keeps the ears warm. She held her hands away from her body so they could see she carried nothing but a folded scrap of fabric, and her eyes were so enormous in her small, thin face that Alara felt her resolve wobble and steady all in the same breath. Because mercy is a reflex you must guard, but not strangle. And if the ward demanded she harden into stone, then it had chosen wrong. The girl announced herself in a voice like snow spilled from a ledge, soft and inevitable. She said her name was Tamsin, that she had come from the ridge with a message from Alara's village, that a woman with a hair lip the miner's son called Aunt Gray had sent her because she could run faster than any of them, and because she was too young to be stopped by men who liked stopping things. And here, her composure cracked long enough for the truth to show through, a flicker of terror and pride, and Alara asked how she reached the courtyard if the ward was closed, and the girl held up the scrap of fabric and said it had belonged to Alara's grandmother. It had been tied around the old woman's hair on the day of the first snow last year. And Aunt Gray had kept it in a tin and told Tamsin to show it to the gate because stone remembers cloth that has soaked up enough tears. And Alara's throat tightened so abruptly She had to look at Kyle to steady herself. But Kyle's face had gone alert in a different way. Not doubt, but the deep focus of a man listening for a second voice under a familiar tune. And he asked Tamsin a question any courtier would fail and any child would answer. What the schoolmistress gave the children on the last day, before frost, if they remembered all their letters. And without hesitation, the girl said a ribbon of paper folded into a bird, because birds know where spring lives. And he nodded once, satisfied, and Alara felt the ring cool with relief because they had not missed the villainy that mattered. She admitted the child. She spoke Tamsin's name into the lattice with the same care she would have used to speak a blessing, and the ward made a narrow hinge of itself, allowing the small body through and knitting shut immediately behind her without, admitting the wind that tried to come in on her heels. The girl ran to Alara and thrust the cloth into her hands, and then, as if the urgency had been holding her up, she began to cry in small, dry sobs that made no sound, the tears of someone who had run out of water long before the grief stopped. The message itself was brief and burned around the edges, where a kitchen fire had carried it halfway into smoke, before a frightened hand snatched it back. Varric's men had taken rooms at the miller's loft and the church porch, not as conquerors but as auditors with ledgers and seals and a traveling larder to feed the village cheap meat and sweet wine for the length of a week in exchange for signatures. And Aunt Gray feared that half the valley would sign anything to be warm, that hunger was the regent's favorite ink, and she begged Alara to remember the petition they had written a summer ago asking the court to fix the road and the bridges, to remember the names on it and speak them with the ring before a witness who mattered, so the valley couldn't be erased and folded into a subsidy. She begged her, too, to keep the ward shut even to sorrow, because there were women with knives who would cut their palms and claim prior's rights if it came to that. And Aunt Gray would rather be called cruel than be made an instrument. The letter's smallness broke Alara in places she had kept hidden even from herself, because it was all she had ever wanted from the world. Not rescue, but the chance to say the names of the people she loved in a place where a decision listened. And she told Tamsin so, and thanked her, and made the girl eat 2 heel ends of bread with honey Marin had kept in her bundle for holy days. And it was while the child licked honey from her thumb, the ring warm against Alara's palm and the ward steady, with the hum of spoken names, that the second betrayal arrived with the confidence of a guest already seated at the table. The steward with the limp, the calm hand, the ledger bound in red. He had been turning pages in the nave with the patience of an artisan. Yet as Alara folded the letter, he closed the book with deliberation and stood, the limp less pronounced than it had been in the cold, and asked Kyle whether the old king's will might be read before midnight, not enacted, simply read, so that a quorum of memory could take hold before the regent's lawyers built their own narrative at dawn. A reasonable request, couched in the very language they had been using to shape their hope, and something in Alara rose to meet it with yes until the ring bit her. Not a sting, but a pressure, like a finger placed on a bruise. And she looked at the steward's left sleeve and saw a single thread of black wool caught in the seam, the same slick black tint the soldiers' cloaks had worn, and the seam itself had been resewn badly, and recently, not with the housewife's neatness she had admired in his other repairs, but with haste and a slight tremor. And Cale saw where she looked and took one slow step toward the man, and the ledger-keeper smiled a tired, almost affectionate smile, and said he would not insult them with denials. That yes, he had been followed when he left the city, and yes, he had believed himself careful enough to shake the shadow at the river ferry and the hillside chapel and the collapsed aqueduct, But grief, he said, makes even the skilled grow sentimental, and he had stopped at a wayside shrine to leave a coin for the old king's spirit. And that was when Varick's hounds took the scent back in their nostrils and carried it like incense. He spoke this with the resignation of a man whose life had been made of clerk's errors and who had learned to wear guilt before it fit. And Alara would have pitied him if he had stopped there, but he opened the ledger while he spoke, and the corners of his mouth hardened, and he told them that the regent had promised him a very civilized mercy, a cottage near the southern marshes, a seat in a minor court, perhaps even a pension, if he simply used the sworn authority of his profession to declare the ledger a royal instrument, and thereby request the reading of the will inside a sanctuary whose rules respected clerical privilege. And then, here his eyes slid to Coil and away in an old habit of subordinates. He would ask, with the full weight of tradition behind him, that the bearer hand the ring to the custodian of records for safekeeping. Just while the reading occurred, for propriety's sake, a request the ward would treat as law, and the bearer would feel as an obligation. And once the metal left Alara's skin, it would not return without calling in every debt left in both their bodies. He had rehearsed this, she realized, not today, but over years of serving men who loved signatures more than souls. And his voice was so reasonable, it almost worked on her backbone, a gentle pressure, urging compliance and good order, and she felt a hot, clean shame. That reason could be used like that, tamed and saddled, and made to pull a cart full of knives. And before she could answer, Sister Marin stepped between them with the consecration bowl held like a shield, and said the rule he wanted. No longer applied because the well had witnessed a new countersign this same night, and the steward sighed as if disappointed in an apprentice, and closed the ledger again. And Alara knew then that this was not the betrayal the night demanded. Only the prelude, the test to see how far the ward could bend without breaking, because even as Marin spoke, the air behind her changed shape, and the boy runner, who had been crouched by the side gate, watchful and trembling with the desire to be useful, let out a sound like a bird striking glass and folded into himself. And when Alara rushed toward him, she saw the thin black filament looped around his wrist, no thicker than hair, and slick with a sheen that made her teeth ache. And the filament ran under the door and into the dark, like a fishing line disappearing into the sea. And beyond the gate a voice laughed once with terrible delight, and the ward hissed, and all at once the lattice brightened, not at the arch, but at the back of the church where no door remained, the webbing pulling itself into a curve that looked exactly like a threshold, where the stones had long ago fallen away. And Kyle shouted a warning that died under the sudden scream of wind, because the regent had not come to force the front. He had come to coax open memory and build a door where a door had once been, exploiting the sanctuary's insistence on honoring its former architecture. And the ward answered because law, like grief, cannot resist its own reflection. They had seconds, maybe less, and in those seconds, Alara saw three things with the kind of clarity that makes the body slower than the mind. The filament around the boy's wrist would drag him backward through the forming threshold and use his entry. As the mortal consent required to flood the nave with soldiers, Sister Marin had already raised the bowl to cut her palm a second time to lay down a counter-charm. But the bowl would be too slow, and she would be gutted for it. Kyle had thrown himself toward the not a door, his hand already turning to shadow, and his mouth already shaping a sound that would rip the air the way a blade rips silk. But if he touched the threshold in that state, the ward would interpret it as an attack from within and collapse in confusion, admitting everything it could not understand. She did not think. She moved, the ring searing her bones as if forging itself deeper into her. And she reached the boy in time to catch his hand in both of hers and yank him hard enough to bruise, feeling the filament bite into her skin under his. And the pain was a white stripe across her vision, a clean, bright misery that made her laugh in her throat. Because there was relief in knowing precisely where to put your body when the world had become math, and she wrapped her wrist in that terrible string and pulled until she felt the hidden hand on the other end give an inch, then another, and the door behind them stuttered like a choking thing. And Varric's voice, so close now it was almost inside her ear, said very softly that she had a talent for ruining entrances. She shouted back that men who needed doors conjured for them were bad at walking, and the sound of Kyle's not-quite laughter behind the terror gave her enough strength to do the unthinkable thing, which was to lift the caught wrists to her mouth and bite down hard where the filament pressed her veins, biting not to cut free, but to bleed onto the wire, to baptize it in what the ring recognized as Royal Seal's water. And for an instant, she tasted rust and pine resin and the river where she had learned to float as a child. And then the filament reacted like living frost, convulsing and recoiling, and the unseen line tore from the boy's wrist and snapped back through the knotador with a sharp crack that sounded like a slap delivered to a face that had never been struck, and the threshold guttered, and the ward rallied to its own sacred stubbornness and sealed the memory back into stone so hard that dust fell from the frescoes like tired snow. Alara stayed standing long enough to see that the boy was free and that Sister Merrin had not been cut, and then her body reminded her that it contained blood, and that blood had decided to look for the floor, and the world tipped, and only Kyle's arm around her waist kept her from falling all the way into the dark, and he laid her down at the foot of the apse with a care that made fury rise in her throat, because tenderness, in that moment, felt like permission to go, and she wasn't going anywhere. He pressed his wrist to her mouth, the old, terrible exchange made simple by necessity, but her throat refused to swallow, not from disgust, from something older and more primal, the body's resistance to being unmade and remade in the same breath. And he whispered her true name in the voice he had used at the well and begged her to take enough to seal the wound. And she tried. She did. But the ring had other ideas. It had been quiet too long, and suddenly it was not quiet. It was a bell rung. Under her breastbone, it was a second heartbeat, waking in a house that had never carried two, and the stone on her finger heated until she could smell her own skin, and crimson light flooded the nave from the cracks in the altar, and from the eyes of the beasts in the mosaic, and from the seam between door and doorframe at the arch, and where the light touched air, it became a wall. Not red lattice now, but a dense, almost liquid dome that enveloped her and the boy and Sister Merron and the steward, and Kale all together, like yolk in a shell. Except no, not Kyle, because when he tried to enter the barrier to reach her, it repelled him with a force that drove him to one knee, the magic interpreting his hunger as threat, and her wound as the only priority. And that was when she understood the shape of the sacrifice the knight had been arranging, because power that wakes to protect you is still a cage if it does not recognize the ones you love. She put both hands flat against the inside of the dome and screamed without sound at it to let him in. She tried to remember the syllables of the old songs. She tried to speak the countersign she had spoken at the well, but the barrier pulsed with the implacable tenderness of an instinct, not a mind. And Kale pressed his palm to the outer surface and sang the lullaby his mother had taught him, the one that turned his rage to water for as long as the notes lasted. And it shimmered, but did not. Open, and in that shining, she saw reflected not the enemy, but the hostage-taker who had once been a friend, the steward, his face crumpled with grief and resolve, clutching the ledger not like a weapon, but like an infant. And she knew, with a certainty that made bile rise, that he would step into the dome if she invited him, that the law would admit him because he wore the right old words and would allow Kyle to enter if the exchange were made through proper channels, and that once inside, the ledger would eat everything it was fed. She shook her head at him with such fury that he took a step back in honest fear. And in that step, the dome at last found a mercy it could live with, a seam opening not wide enough for a body, but wide enough for a voice, and Kyle poured his into the gap. Not words, not command, just a sound like a winter river finding a new path, and the ring cooled under her skin, and she could swallow again. And she did, gulping his blood like a beggar takes soup after too many dignified refusals. And the wound at her wrist sealed so fast, she cried out at the itch of knitting skin, and the dome began to thin along its edges as if ashamed of its own excess. Beyond the ward, the night had not been idle. Varric's men had returned to the Nada door with tools that gleamed like wet bones, and the regent himself now stood at the arch with a priest in pale robes whose mouth moved constantly as if counting, counter-prior or some such, who believed that any threshold could be undone if given the right audit. And when the dome drained down to a sheen over the floor like spilled oil, the regent lifted one hand in benediction that was also a threat, and said, clear enough for even the stones to hear, that the time for games had finished, that the village had eaten and signed, that the court had tolerated enough theater from an innkeeper who mistook pity for authority, and that he would now end the farce by invoking the one mechanism even sanctuaries could not deny, the right of retrieval granted to a living sovereign to reclaim royal instruments held by subjects who could not guarantee their safety. And Alara would have laughed if she had had the breath, because men like him always believed safety meant possession and never trust. She stood with her legs shaking and her hand in Kyle's, and said that there was no living sovereign here to invoke anything but mercy. And he smiled with real pleasure, and said that was the beauty of Ku. They make sovereigns in the time it takes to, oaths to cool. And then he spoke a name that had not belonged to him at dusk, and belonged to him now, crowned by a circle of knives in a cellar, while a choir of cowards hummed the anthem, and the ward shivered with legal recognition, even as the saints in the mosaics looked ready to peel themselves off the wall and enter the argument. The next moments were not a battle so much as a collision of grammars, countersigns flung against decrees, salt against title, blood against wax, the ledger's dry rasp against the well's soft breathing, and in that jagged music, Alara saw the whole history of both species laid bare, the long habit of confusing victory with hunger, and she understood in a flash that none of it would end, so long as Varric stood outside, and men like the steward stood within their own griefs, repeating other men's sentences. And she did the only thing that felt like stepping off the wheel, which was to leave the shelter of the downed dome entirely and walk to the edge of the arch, where the ward was thickest, so close to the regent that she could see the flecks of winter in his eyes and the honest awe he felt for nothing but his own competence. And she lifted the ring to the mesh of red light and said in a voice that moved like a blade through fruit that the will inside the seal could not be retrieved by a sovereign made this night, or a prior bought this winter, that it would open only to the oath of a king who had held his son with hands that did not tremble, and to the vow of a mortal who had nothing to gain by telling the truth. And then she did. Something that killed her a little and remade her a little. She pressed the stone hard enough into the lattice to cut the skin beneath, and whispered the old king's name as if it were a prayer she had been waiting her whole life to be asked to. Remember. And the ring answered not with light this time, but with a sound, like a latch lifted in a house she had only ever seen from the road. And Varric's face changed, not to fear yet, to disbelief that any mechanism existed he had not anticipated, and before he could build a new lever out of that shock, the ward itself chose a side. Not human or vampire, not king or regent, but life over hunger, naming Kyle aloud in a voice that belonged to no throat and to all the echoed singers of the chapel. Admitting him finally, not as petitioner, but as heir, and the barrier opened for him as it hadn't for the steward's credentials, and Kyle stepped through, and everything that happened afterward would be remembered in the valley in the way storms are, remembered by the way the trees grow after. When Kale stepped through the arch, the night itself seemed to recoil, as if the cold and the silence had realized they had been keeping company with the wrong kind of creature. The air thickened, bending around him in invisible currents, and for the first time, Ilara saw the truth that his exile had hidden. The raw force that could have razed kingdoms, the fire of a bloodline that had once ruled the night, not by fear alone, but by command of the elements themselves. His presence was not just seen, but felt, a weight that made the torches flicker sideways and the snow beyond the threshold lift, as though gravity had forgotten its duty. Varric's soldiers hesitated, that smallest of pauses born from instinct, when the body knows what the mind denies. They had seen Kale wounded, hunted, half-starved, and broken. They had not seen the heir of the first throne restored to his element. The regent recovered first, of course. Power never believes in anything larger than its own reflection. He smiled the way predators do before they play, and his voice carried through the barrier as if the world itself leaned to hear him. "At last," he said, "my brother returns to his birthright. Late, but not uninvited." The soldiers behind him knelt as he raised a hand, and the priest beside him unfurled a scroll that shimmered like skin, thin as a nightmare. "I offer you what you claim to desire: acknowledgement, reconciliation, and the return of your crown, Kyle Draven. But the world has changed since you fled. The throne demands obedience, not sentiment." His gaze slid to Ilara, and certainly not affection for mortal strays. Kyle's laugh was quiet, hollowed by centuries. "Obedience built your crown, brother. Sentiment built mine, and mine has survived every grave they dug for it." The ward between them shimmered, as if caught between fire and water, and in that shimmer, the black stone of Ilara's ring began to bleed light. Kale turned to her, not as commander to subordinate, but as one half of an oath to the other, and said, "Whatever happens now, don't step back. It must see both of us, alive and bound." Ilara felt no fear, only a strange calm that came when there was nothing left to lose. She could taste her own blood at the back of her throat, copper and warmth and promise. And when she lifted her hand, the light between them flared until it hurt to look. The ring split along its surface, lines of red crawling through silver like veins through marble, and a sound came from it. Not a voice, but the pressure of a thought made audible. Kale answered it without words, only movement, a gesture that looked like prayer, but was older than language. The ward dissolved. There was no clash of swords, no cinematic storm of violence. There was only stillness, and then the world imploded. The soldiers' torches flared green and vanished. The ground beneath the monastery groaned like something ancient turning in its sleep. Ilara's knees nearly buckled, but Cale caught her, his hand cold and sure at her back. "Hold on to me," he said, and she realized he meant it literally. His pulse had synced with hers through the ring, each beat echoing in both bodies, a duet written in flesh. When Varric moved forward, his cloak trailing mist, the air folded around him, heavy with corruption. He raised his hand, and what should have been shadow coiled out of it, a darkness too thick to be absence. "You were always too fond of humans," he said. "Let her devotion be your undoing." Kyle didn't answer. He didn't need to. The red light from the ring twisted upward, forming a spiral that wrapped around them both, a shape halfway between flame and wing. When Varric's darkness met it, the clash was soundless. Two histories colliding. The blast shattered the snowfield, flinging shards of ice through the air like glass. The soldiers were thrown back. The priest collapsed, the scroll burning into nothing. Cale staggered, but didn't fall. He turned his head toward Ilara, and his eyes, once that pale, exhausted crimson, were now wholly black, the color of the space between stars. "Cale," she whispered, "you're killing yourself." He smiled faintly, and she saw in it the gentleness that had always been there, hidden behind centuries of bitterness. Not killing, balancing. His hands trembled as he spread them wide, calling the last of his power. "I was born of the night. You were born of mercy. It needs both." The ground split between them and the regent. From the fissure rose the old king's symbol, the crown of thorns encircling the sun, burning brighter than any torch. Varric's face twisted in recognition, and for the first time his confidence broke. "You can't invoke him," he snarled. "His blood's dust. His name is forbidden." "Then let the dust judge us," Kyle said. He reached for Ilara's hand, and the ring fused fully to her skin, merging their pulses, their heat, their will. The light that came from them was no longer red, but white, shot through with gold, the color of dawn forced into midnight. Varric screamed, not in pain, but in refusal, as the light spread over him like an ocean. The soldiers fell where they stood. The ward's shattered fragments rose from the snow and became mirrors, showing each witness their own face twisted by greed, by cruelty, by servitude, until the darkness devoured itself. When the light receded, Kyle and Ilara stood alone amid the ruin of the courtyard. The snow had melted to reveal earth that steamed and bled with color. Crimson moss, pale flowers, green vines curling upward, as though centuries of frost had been undone in a single heartbeat. Kyle fell to one knee, his strength gone. Ilara knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "It's over," she said, not sure if she was lying. He shook his head. "No, not yet. He bound his life to mine, as I once bound mine to you. He's not gone. He's buried inside the bond. If I live, so does he. Then we'll end it together." He looked up at her then, and she saw tears, real, human tears, mixing with the blood at the corner of his mouth. "You can't. It's my lineage that holds him, not yours. You'd have to." But she already knew. The ring pulsed between them, as if listening. "You said it yourself," she whispered. "It needs both." She pressed her palm to his chest, over the heart that had refused to die, and leaned close enough that her breath became his. "You gave me life when you should have taken it. Now let me give it back." Cale tried to stop her, but she was faster. She drew the dagger from his belt, the one forged for royal vows, not war, and drove it through her own palm, pressing the bleeding hand to his heart. The ring flared once, and the world exploded in light. Kyle shouted her name, but the sound was lost in the roar. The energy that burst from her wound raced through him like fire through veins of oil, and for one terrible instant, he saw everything through her eyes. The tavern, the child, the snow, the mercy that had made her open a door instead of bolt it. And the enormity of her compassion was unbearable. It burned him cleaner than any flame. The regent's last scream echoed faintly across the hills, swallowed by the wind. When silence returned, Kyle was still kneeling, Ilara's body limp in his arms. Her eyes were open, clouded not with death, but with the strange serenity of those who have crossed into something larger. The ring had turned to ash between their hands. He tried to speak, to beg her to come back, but there were no words left that hadn't already been spoken in the blood they shared. He laid her gently on the ground, the first snow of the new storm beginning to fall around them. The scent of frost and earth mingled with the faint sweetness of her hair. The ward was gone, the monastery in ruins, but the air no longer felt haunted. Somewhere beyond the mountains, dawn was rising. Kyle looked up at the paling sky and whispered, "If there is light after death, meet me there." Then, with the care of someone performing a final ritual, he lifted her wrist to his mouth. His fangs pierced her skin, soft, reverent, not a predator's bite, but a lover's benediction. And he drank, not to feed, but to return what little of himself remained. The power that moved through him was gentle this time, almost merciful. When he stopped, her lips parted, a small breath escaping, the faintest trace of color returning to her cheeks. He gathered her close, uncertain if what stirred in her was life or memory, and whispered, "Come back, Ilara." Her fingers twitched. The wound in her palm sealed, leaving a faint scar in the shape of the ring. She drew a shuddering breath and opened her eyes, now tinged faintly gold where brown had once been. "Kyle," she said, her voice hoarse. "What have you done?" "Balanced it," he answered. "Half of me for half of you." The dawn reached them then, pure and relentless, spilling over the broken walls. It struck Kyle first, and for a moment his skin smoked as if the curse still clung to him. But instead of burning, the light sank in, gilding the pale veins beneath his skin until he looked carved of marble and flame. He looked at his hands in disbelief, then at Ilara, who was smiling through her tears. "It seems," she said, "the night can forgive after all." He laughed, a sound as fragile as it was joyous, and the echo of it rolled down the mountain like thunder that had forgotten how to frighten. Around them, the last remnants of the old frost melted. The monastery's cracked bell, untouched for 100 years, shifted in its cradle and rang once, a note so clear it might have been a heartbeat. Kyle stood and lifted Ilara with him, their shadows long and one. Behind them, the world began to heal. As they stepped into the light, the wind carried away the ashes of the ring, scattering them like seeds. Where they landed, the earth glimmered faintly, as though remembering what had been promised here, that compassion, once given, can never be unmade. The story that began with a meal offered to a stranger had become a legend that would outlive both of them, told by firesides in winters to come, of the woman who fed a prince and the prince who learned what it meant to be human. And though the tale would change, though names would blur, the truth would remain. One act of kindness had broken the oldest curse, and from that moment forward, the sun rose a little higher over the kingdom of the night. The first sunrise over St. Aerith's in living memory came without fanfare, as if the heavens themselves had decided that miracles did not need witnesses. The snow, which had been the mountain's shroud for centuries, began to loosen its hold on the earth, the crust cracking and sinking to reveal dark soil that drank the light like wine. The old trees around the monastery shivered and straightened, their bark glistening with dew instead of frost, and birds that had long since fled the high passes returned in erratic bursts of color, filling the air with the unsteady joy of those who do not yet believe they are free. Chaol and Alara stood at the threshold, where shadow and dawn braided together in mist, and for a long time neither spoke, because words seemed like crude tools in the aftermath of something that had rewritten the world. His cloak was torn beyond repair, hers stiff with blood that had dried into a pattern she would later learn, resembled the crest of the first king, and yet they both looked strangely unbroken. When she reached for his hand, she expected cold marble and found warmth, faint but growing, the pulse under his skin no longer borrowed from her, but his own. The sun touched his cheek, and he did not flinch. He looked at it with the cautious wonder of a man learning the shape of a long-lost god, and whispered that it was heavier than he remembered. They descended the mountain, not as fugitives, but as pilgrims returning from a dream. The air carried the scent of thawed pine and the faint sweetness of wet stone, and along the lower paths they passed travelers frozen mid-gesture, soldiers, priests, and merchants who had fallen in the night when the curse broke, now stirring awake, as though from deep sleep, blinking at the light and asking each other what day it was. None of them recognized Chaol until the wind caught his hair and revealed the faint glimmer of the crown mark that had once branded his bloodline. A few fell to their knees out of reflex, others simply stared, too tired for reverence. Alara told them to stand, her voice steady and low, saying that kneeling had done enough harm for one lifetime. Chaol smiled at her, then with the quiet understanding of someone who had finally found the reason he survived so long, to listen when another heart speaks sense into the ruins. By the time they reached Draymont, spring had come to meet them halfway. The valley that had been a white desert only days before now pulsed with meltwater streams, and the first wildflowers pushed their stubborn heads through the mud. The village was unrecognizable in the clean light, roofs repaired, doors unbarred, the churchyard no longer haunted by the scent of decay, but alive with herbs planted between the graves as offerings for peace. When Alara stepped onto the familiar road, children ran from the square shouting her name, some carrying bits of cloth, others holding up bread, as tribute to the woman who had fed a stranger and returned with the dawn. She wept without shame, and Chaol stood behind her, letting the warmth of that human noise fill the hollows where centuries of silence had lived. The inn she had lost was a black skeleton against the hill, but she saw life there too. Aunt Gray and the miners' kin clearing debris, setting new beams, laughter rising where smoke once hung. When they saw her, they stopped, then came running, not with fear or awe, but the awkward affection of those who have mourned too soon. Chaol watched from a distance at first, unwilling to intrude, until Alara turned and beckoned him with the smallest tilt of her head. The villagers hesitated as he approached, instinct tugging them backward, yet the morning light clung to him as proof of his change, and when he offered a small, formal bow, the gesture of a prince acknowledging equals, the tension cracked. Aunt Gray spat into her palm and shook his hand, declaring that any man who could make the sun rise over Draymont deserved breakfast. And that was how the first treaty between humans and vampires began. Not in marble halls, but beside a half-rebuilt tavern with smoke in the chimney and bread in the oven. Over the next days, they gathered survivors from both sides of the old conflict, men who had served Varric and found themselves masterless, women who had hidden their immortal children in cellars, monks who had prayed to indifferent gods, and now found those prayers answered by human hands. They came cautiously, then in waves, drawn by the rumor of light that no one burned under. Kyle and Alara slept little. By day they worked among the villagers. By night they spoke with emissaries from the courts, some trembling with the memory of their old hunger, some daring to dream of coexistence. The first accord was written in soot on the back of a wine ledger. No feeding without consent, no hunting within human lands, shared watchfires along the mountain passes, and mutual protection against those who still worshipped the old cruelty. It was not law yet, only promise, but the promise was enough to keep the peace through that first fragile season. The people began to call Kyle the Dusk King because he could walk under both moon and sun, and Alara the Dawn Keeper, though she laughed at the title, saying she had never kept anything that didn't wander off eventually. When midsummer came, the rebuilt bell of St. Aerith's rang again, not in warning, but in celebration. A new ceremony took place beneath the open sky, the first in which humans and vampires stood side by side without weapon or ward. Kale spoke briefly, his words chosen like stones laid to bridge a river. He did not ask for forgiveness or loyalty, only for vigilance against the return of fear, which he named the oldest curse of all. Alara followed, her voice carrying across the fields, reminding them that compassion had ended what armies could not, and that the world changed not by decrees, but by the moment someone opened a door instead of turning the lock. That night, they sat together on the hill above Draymont, watching fireflies rise like fragments of fallen stars. Kyle's head rested against her shoulder, his breath slow, steady, human. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "The darkness?" He smiled, eyes half closed. "It's still here. I just see what else it hides now." She traced the faint scar where the ring had been and felt no pain, only memory. The bond between them remained, quieter now, a current beneath the skin that hummed when they touched, but demanded nothing. "What will we be," she said, "when the stories start to forget our names?" Kyle looked at the horizon, where the first light of dawn blurred the stars. "We'll be what they need us to be. Symbols are kinder than rulers, and perhaps that's enough." Below them, the valley shimmered with morning mist, fields newly green, roofs glinting like coins, the river unfreezing into laughter. The world, reborn from ashes and fear, breathed evenly again. The curse that had once bound night and day apart was gone, replaced by the living rhythm of balance. Alara leaned her head against his and whispered that every ending was only a different kind of beginning. When the sun climbed fully over the ridge, its light touched them both, and for the first time in 1,000 years, neither flinched. The world had healed, and so had they.